Moment to thank you all for joining us here today. I'm Stephanie. I'm here with Every Dog, a nonprofit based here in Austin, Texas. We are dedicated to making sure that everyone has the access to behavior and training resources that they need. Thank you all to folks that donated to be here today. We cannot do everything that we do without your donations. If you would like to donate, you can do that at everydogaustin.org/donate. Some quick reminders for today. Please keep yourself muted at all times. We are going to take some questions at the end for the speaker. This webinar is being recorded, so if you have to pop out for a minute, please don't worry. We will send you a copy at the end. And now I would like to kick it off to our speaker to go ahead and introduce themselves and go ahead and start our presentation today.
Thank you so much. My name is Heather Garish. I'm a veterinarian in Arizona and a resident of the American College of Veterinary Behaviorists. And I am very honored to be speaking with Every Dog today. I'm just super passionate about their mission and glad to be able to collaborate in this way. So today we're going to be talking about canine cognition from my perspective as a veterinary behavior resident. So just a little outline of the plan for today, kind of talk about the veterinary perspective for understanding dog behavior, and then get a little bit deeper into ways of understanding dog behavior in general. Then jump into the history of the study of cognition, some areas of study in canine cognition, and future pathways for research. So I want to start with a little disclaimer, which is that although I'm very excited to talk about cognition, I am approaching it from a very specific lens. So I'm a veterinary behavior resident and a dog lover. And what that means is I approach companion animals with problematic behaviors holistically. So we look at physical health, environmental needs, psychological factors, kind of the holistic picture of the dog that can be contributing to their problematic behaviors. And so although I'm not a canine cognition researcher, I do read the literature and it informs my clinical practice. This is a huge topic, and there's been an absolute explosion of research in recent years on canine cognition. So we'll really just be scratching the surface today. But what I'm hoping to answer in this presentation or begin to think about in this presentation is how can the evolving science of canine cognition help us understand the world through our dog's eyes? And really, from my perspective, how can canine cognition help me better treat patients? And for all of us, how can we better provide for the needs of our dogs? So I want to start with a little background about how veterinarians look at things in general. So when a patient presents with any clinical sign, and that's what we call symptoms in veterinary medicine because symptoms are really a subjective experience. So we can't ask our patients to really describe how they're feeling, but we can see the outward presentation, and that's their clinical signs. When we're presented with any clinical signs, whether it's vomiting or a behavior, we'll go through a set approach to try to understand the underlying potential causes and develop a treatment plan. And so we begin by investigating those clinical signs. We conduct a physical exam and possibly diagnostics to look at potential medical contributors. And then we'll formulate a differential diagnosis list and start to narrow down potential causes for the behavior. And then we'll formulate a treatment plan, which can include management, behavior modification, and potentially medications or nutraceuticals, as well as treating underlying physical disease that can be contributing to the behavior. But viewing behaviors as a sign or symptom only really makes sense if we understand what's normal for the dog, right? We cannot say that a behavior is a problem until we understand what's normal for the dog. And that's why really this approach looking at any physical disease leads to the first half of the veterinary curriculum being dedicated to understanding normal anatomy and physiology. Because you can't recognize illness, disease, if you don't understand what normal looks like and what health looks like. So for the application of this medical model to behavior, we have to understand normal behavior. So how do we do that? Well, without a scientific study of animal behavior, what we're left with is unfortunately a set of sometimes helpful and sometimes unhelpful assumptions about our canine companions. So this leads me to think of the term anthropomorphism, which is the practice of treating gods, animals, or objects as if they had human qualities. And as I was putting together the final stages of my presentation today, I looked back at some recent EveryDog presentations and was really excited to see that Ashley Lambert spoke in depth about anthropomorphism just a few weeks ago. So I encourage you to take a look at that presentation to dive a little bit further into this topic. I think a lot of us in the dog training and behavior world have really focused on maintaining objectivity and a scientific approach to behavior. And while that's helpful, I think we can risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we reject anthropomorphism entirely. Specifically, I do feel there is value in recognizing our similarities because it can help promote empathy, maintain the human-animal bond, and keep us interested in the well-being of other species by recognizing our commonalities. So for some of us, empathy comes really naturally despite differences, but for others, understanding our similarities through that lens of anthropomorphism can really help bridge to make empathy more accessible. On the other hand, there are a variety of ways in which anthropomorphism can fail to serve us if we are interested in being good caretakers and companions for dogs. I have a few listed here, and we'll go into some examples in greater detail in the next few slides. So one problem is that we can draw inaccurate conclusions about the emotions or motivations underlying a behavior. A great example of this is the perceived guilty look that many pet parents observe when returning home to their dog who has gotten into something, house soiled, etc. I can't see everyone's faces, but I suspect many of you are familiar with this concept and some of the problems associated with it. So to look back at kind of the actual literature around this guilty look and how we arrived at the conclusion that's probably not what's going on for dogs. In 2009, canine cognition researcher Alexandra Horowitz sought to test whether the perceived guilty look was more likely after a misbehavior. And the specific behavior that she looked at was whether the dog took a treat that they were not supposed to. I see, oh, okay, froze for a second there, but I think I'm back. So interactions were assessed via video in homes. Owners were told that the study was an assessment of their dog's obedience at a distance. Owners were instructed to tell their dog not to eat the treat and then leave the living room. And experimenters controlled whether the dog did or did not eat the treat by either giving it to them or taking it away before they could grab it. And then they instructed the owner to respond either with scolding or a happy greeting. And dogs did not show more guilty behaviors when they ate the treat than when they did not, but they did show more, quote, guilty behaviors when they were scolded. So this provided support for the notion that probably what's going on with the guilty look is more likely correlated with the scolding on the part of the owner than with the dog's awareness of and guilt for misbehavior. And probably that's not new for a lot of you guys, but I think it's interesting that actually came from the science of cognition. Another problem can be having unrealistic expectations for behavior. So a huge area for concern is normal but unwanted behaviors. So things like rolling in something stinky outside, urine marking, chewing household objects, all can be normal behaviors for dogs, but problematic in a home setting. And if we don't understand dog behavior and instead approach from an anthropomorphic lens, then we can be at risk of misunderstanding those things. Another way that unrealistic expectations can crop up is assuming that a dog conceives of a concept the same way that we might. So, for example, I think about the idea of generalizing cues to different contexts and this idea that a dog, quote, knows a behavior and is or is not obeying in a specific context, versus having curiosity about what might be challenging for them. So for my dog, who is a little 10-pound miniature dachshund, performing the sit cue, which means putting her body in the position of this dog on the picture, requires significant repeated reinforcement on different surfaces before she could perform it reliably. So sitting on pavement was a no-go for her at first. And when we have some curiosity about that, it brings up different contingencies for her, right? The rough surface of the pavement is uncomfortable under her body. And so she required a lot of reinforcement history in that context to decide that, that was worth doing. And fully separate from this question of generalizing and kind of reinforcement history is actually the cognitive ability to generalize behaviors to different contexts. So the first instance, we're kind of looking at motivation and how does motivation vary in different contexts. And the cognitive ability to generalize has to do with flexible thinking. So we'll talk a little bit more about that flexibility and thinking a little bit later in the presentation. Another problem with anthropomorphism is expecting dogs to enjoy the same things that people enjoy. So for humans as primates, hugging and kissing are an important and normal part of our behavioral repertoire for expressing affection within relationships. But assuming that dogs communicate affection in the same way can be problematic. These photos, I just pulled stock photos from Microsoft and searched for hugging a dog, and every photo I came up with, the dog was showing body language of discomfort with that interaction. So body language that we can see in these pictures, ears back, leaning away, tight facial musculature, whites of the eyes showing. So unfortunately, when we use anthropomorphism as our lens to understand dog behavior, we can inadvertently communicate exactly the opposite of what we are trying to communicate with our interactions with our dogs. So instead of saying, I'm safe and connected, we can be making our dogs feel threatened. And then a last example of problems with anthropomorphism is, of course, we can't assume that the same things that we enjoy and find safe to eat are safe for dogs. Fortunately, this is pretty uncommon for dogs, but it can be a massive issue with avian and exotic species, just being fed things that they shouldn't, and can really lead to significant disease. There's all sorts of ways that we might assume our dogs prefer to eat, sleep, rest, play, based on human preferences that are inapplicable or even potentially harmful to dogs. So problems with anthropomorphism, despite its ability to promote empathy. So if not anthropomorphism, how do we understand what our dogs are thinking and feeling? So for 5-year-old me, my plan was to talk to dogs, like Dr. Dolittle. I thought maybe I'd grow up and be a vet that could talk to animals. And actually, I think that that's what drew me to behavior, since one of the best ways for us to develop an understanding of the inner world of animals is through observing and seeking to understand their behavior. So that brings us to the scientific study of behavior and the inner world of dogs. In addition to the medical model, there are many different fields of inquiry into dog behavior. So I'm just listing some of them here. And we're going to jump into a few of them that are important to clinical animal behavior before delving more specifically into cognition. So the first field I want to talk about in a little more detail is ethology. The formal study of animal behavior as a scientific discipline has its roots in the works of naturalists like Charles Darwin in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, ethology emerged as the scientific and objective study of animal behavior under natural conditions. And I have early definition from Eisner and Wilson that talks about the functions of behavior and also the evolutionary history of the behaviors that are seen. In the mid-20th century, key early figures in ethology included Konrad Lorenz, who is famous for studying imprinting in geese, Nicholas Tinbergen, who developed the 4 questions framework for looking at behavior from causation, development, function, and evolution, and von Frisch, who studied communication in honeybees. And those 3 scientists shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1973. So this was kind of one of the early disciplines that start to really take a scientific approach to looking at behavior and understanding the impact of evolution, genetics, and the environment on behavior. Also, with origins around the turn of the 20th century and as a reaction to the early psychological approach of introspectionism, which was kind of looking inward at one's own thoughts and feelings. The behaviorist approach presented another methodology for understanding animal behavior. And really, it was reaction to the idea that introspectionism wasn't very scientific. So behaviorism took the lens that we really should only be studying and commenting on observable behaviors. So I'll talk about a few key figures in behaviorism in the next few slides. So I think many of us are familiar with the work of Pavlov. So Pavlov looked at reflexive behaviors, which are an involuntary and automatic response to a stimulus. And actually, Pavlov originally was studying digestion in dogs. So studying their reflexive behavior of salivation when presented with food. But he noted that dogs would salivate when stimuli associated with feeding, like the sight of a food dish or the lab assistant approaching. They would kind of begin to salivate before even being presented with food. And so based on that, he developed an experiment to test this phenomenon using a bell. So initially, the unconditioned stimulus, meaning that we get that reflexive response of salivation, is the food. So presented with food, dogs are going to salivate without conscious thought or awareness. And then initially, that neutral stimulus of the bell, or in this image, a whistle, doesn't elicit salivation, right? It's not associated with food. But if the bell is repeatedly presented immediately before food, then the dogs would develop a conditioned response of salivation when presented with that bell, even in the absence of food. And then expanding and building on that work, there is this definitely unethical by modern standards experiment with little Albert, who was a 9-month-old infant. The researcher John Watson demonstrated that actually emotional responses could be classically conditioned as well. So at the beginning of the experiment, this little 9-month-old infant was not fearful of any of the stimuli in the upper right-hand corner. But by repeatedly pairing the white rat with a loud, scary noise, the researchers not only managed to condition a fear response to the rat in little Albert, so when he saw the rat, he was scared, but also demonstrated fear generalization, which means that even stimuli that were not directly involved in that original pairing, things like a white rabbit or a white fluffy dog or Santa's beard, could still elicit that fear response in little Albert. So obviously a lot of problems with that experiment from the perspective of harm to the participant, but we did learn that associative learning can happen with emotions as well. And that is a huge part of the work that veterinary behaviorists do in helping dogs with fears and phobias today. So then building further in the field of behaviorism, Thorndike developed this puzzle box on the left. So that was an experimental device that he could use to study learning. So cats actually were his species of study, and the cats were placed in the puzzle box and they had to operate a lever or a string or some other device to open the box and get out and get to food. And Thorndike observed that the cats used trial and error to figure out how they could get out of the box, but that with each repetition, the cats were quicker to escape. So Thorndike developed the law of effect, which is that actions that are followed by pleasant consequences are more likely to be repeated. And then building on that, B.F. Skinner, who is considered the father of operant conditioning, developed this apparatus on the right. We call it a Skinner box. I read that he was pretty adamant that he didn't want the device named after him. So operant conditioning chamber is another way of describing it. But basically an animal, in this case a rat, could be presented with a lever or button, some kind of device to interact with the apparatus. And with the appropriate response, the rat would receive reinforcement in the form of food being dispensed. And with the inappropriate response, the floor is actually electrified and could deliver a shock. So Skinner described the impacts of both reinforcement and punishment on behavior. So he just defined reinforcement as a consequence that increases the frequency of a target behavior and punishment as a consequence that decreases the frequency of the behavior. So we won't get too much further into learning theory because that could easily fill an hour on its own. But I wanted to mention this because an understanding of operant conditioning and how reinforcement works is a really critical component of both animal training in general and behavior modification in clinical animal behavior. And of course, now we focus exclusively on reinforcement of desirable behaviors for our canine companions and don't advocate the use of punishment. And I wanted to throw this in here for just an odd little piece of psychological history and a point of clarification. This is actually B.F. Skinner's daughter, and he designed an apparatus called an air crib. So this was not an operant conditioning chamber. He was not training the baby, but rather it was a climate-controlled crib that was intended to be safer and more convenient for baby rearing. I think it shows that sometimes those of us in science, things don't translate well to the real world. So obviously did not gain a ton of popularity, but an interesting little piece of history. And I'll pause here just to say that there are many other frameworks for conceptualizing and understanding dog thoughts, emotions, and behaviors than the ones we are discussing today. But I want to make the shift now to cognition or the cognitive revolution. And really, there were a couple of major historical events that promoted this cognitive revolution. One is the development of computer technology, which really gave us a framework for sort of talking about learning and thinking processes. And then also advanced neuroimaging. And so with those developments, there's been an explosion of research into the brain and behavior from a new cognitive lens. So what is cognition? I've included two definitions here because they explain this same concept a little bit differently. So I think the first one is good in that it um, kind of specifies some of the components of cognition. Cognition is a term for the mental processes that take place in the brain, including thinking, attention, language, learning, memory, and perception. And the second term actually comes from the seminal text on cognitive psychology in 1967 and defines cognition as all processes by which the sensory input is transformed, reduced, elaborated, stored, recovered, and used. And I think that second definition is helpful because really this can apply to a variety of species. It's not exclusive to humans. So how do we get that sensory input and use it for life? Components of cognition include perception, attention, and that's kind of how do we focus our sensory input because there's a lot of stimuli coming in all the time. Memory, which refers to that storage and encoding, language and communication, and then problem solving. So because I come from a veterinary perspective, I think a good starting place for us to think about canine cognition is through the lens of anatomy. And I chose cartoony images for this slide to avoid anatomy specimens that I know can be kind of gross or upsetting, but we do have an MRI image coming up as well on the next page. So the illustrations aren't perfect, but they do give you a good sense of what we're looking at. And I think to me, something that stands out really immediately about these two brains, so we've got on the left a dog brain and on the right a human brain, is big picture, just how similar they look. There's many shared basic structures. So we've got our cerebral cortex. That's that wrinkly part with the gyri and sulci. Those are the folds and the wrinkles in the brain. It's responsible for higher order thinking, processing sensory information, and voluntary movement. And in both dogs and humans, it is organized into lobes. So the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. And then the cerebellum is another structure that I think you can see, you can appreciate really grossly as very, very similar between the two species. And that's important for coordinating balance and movement. We also both have a limbic system, and that is a little tricky to see. It's kind of buried. Many of the structures are buried under that cerebral cortex and kind of more towards the middle of the brain. But that is responsible for regulating emotions, motivation, and memory. And then we both have a brainstem. So that's kind of these structures. The pons and medulla. And that brainstem is really responsible for basic survival functions. So things like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure that need to happen automatically without conscious awareness and are important for keeping us alive. So really, again, you can see, I think in this image, how similar the two brains are, but there's also a few things that stand out that are different. So the overall size of the brain, both absolute and relative to body size, which is something that we call the encephalization quotient, is larger for humans than for dogs. So the encephalization quotient for humans is around 7 versus 1.2 for dogs. Another thing that I think stands out really obviously here, again, this is a little bit of a cartoonish representation, but you can see this massive olfactory bulb, which is not present on the human specimen in that size. We do have an olfactory bulb, but it does not protrude like that. It's not as obvious. And it's about 3 times larger in dogs than in humans. And so olfactory is to do with the sense of smell. And really the size of that portion of the brain correlates with dogs' olfactory acuity, so their ability to distinguish things, and the importance of the sense of smell for dogs. And then another key takeaway, I think, from this is just that all of the analogous structures that we see help us understand phenomena like animal learning and emotions, knowing that many of those things are quite likely to be similar, and we're getting more and more evidence for that with functional magnetic resonance imaging studies. So here's just another picture showing the same information. This is from a researcher who does functional MRI. And on the left, we've got a dog brain. On the right, we've got a human brain. Again, you can see the structures that are conserved between the two species. And you can also see that large olfactory bulb in the dog, as well as the size difference. The image is not to scale, but I think you can kind of generally appreciate the much larger volume of cerebral cortex in the human brain. So now we're going to jump into a little bit more of the components of cognition. So we'll start with perception, and that's how information from the outside world, from the environment, enters into our awareness, the awareness of the central nervous system. So we'll start with vision. Dog's sense of vision is really adapted for hunting and the ability to distinguish things in low light. There's wide variation across different breeds in visual anatomy based on skull shape. There's actually an interesting paper looking at the differences in both kind of the more obvious structures. So you can kind of picture a Chihuahua might have a little bit more like prominent eyeballs versus a dog with a more elongated face, but also even some of that internal anatomy difference differs in different dog breeds. Dogs can see colors, but their vision is dichromatic. So that's actually quite similar to red-green color blindness. And people have that condition, including my husband. So some of us are able to appreciate a little bit more clearly how dogs perceive color. And then another important difference from a vision perspective is the presence of the tapetum lucidum. So that's that structure at the back of the eye that causes the reflective green eye appearance in photos and helps to reflect low light and improve vision in low light conditions. I just saw that question coming through about the title of the paper, and I have it in my reference list at the end, and I can bring your attention to it. So for hearing, there are a few important differences in human and dog hearing. The ability to hear low frequencies is pretty similar between humans and dogs, but dogs can hear higher pitched sounds better than humans and can also hear softer, quieter sounds better than people. So that can be an important thing to keep in mind with, from my perspective, with behavioral disorders that pertain to sounds, things like sound phobias. Also, an interesting difference with many non-human animals versus humans is their ability to move their ears. So the pinnae, those the flaps of the ears or the ears that perk up, can orient to sound. And then the sense of smell, of course, we saw that olfactory bulb. In the olfactory epithelium, dogs have 220 million to 2 billion neurons, whereas humans have between 2 and 5 million. So it's a pretty massive difference in the innervation of those structures. again, I'll have this reference in my reference slide, but there is an interesting study looking at explosive detection dogs that showed that in both good and poor light, dogs were prioritizing olfaction, that sense of smell, over vision. So it seems to be an important sense for them, both based on the anatomy and on some literature about how they prioritize sensory input. We also have a study from Dr. Haupt, who's a veterinary behaviorist, that looked at the sense of smell and its relation to food preferences in dogs. So it does seem to be important in that regard. Dogs have fewer taste buds than humans, but they can taste many of the same flavors that we can. So sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. They can develop taste preferences and aversion. I think that should not come as a surprise to anybody that has a dog or anybody in the veterinary field. We see that really commonly in sick animals. And dogs have a tendency to prefer sweet over bitter and salty foods. And then again, that sense of touch. So similar anatomy as far as structures in the skin. And oops, go back to that one. Structures in the skin and hair follicles, structures for sensing tactile stimuli. But just important to know that, keeps going back. Dogs can have preferences just like people can. So not every dog enjoys the same touch sensations. Okay. Beyond anatomy, looking at the brain anatomy and sensory anatomy, how can we assess cognition in dogs? So this image is from the Duke Canine Cognition Center and shows an apparatus for cognitive testing. I want to take a brief detour here because there's some important behavioral genetics history that plays into some of the canine cognition research. So on the left, we have the book Genetics and the Social Behavior of the Dog, which is the result of a 20-year study ending in 1965, conducted by Scott and Fuller, that looked at the roles of genetics and early life experience in shaping dog behavior. So the researchers crossbred 5 different dog breeds, Basenjis, Cocker Spaniels, Beagles, Shelties, and wire-haired Fox Terriers, and standardized rearing procedures to investigate the roles of genes and the environment on the behavior of dogs. Scott and Fuller identified the sensitive period for socialization in dogs as lasting from around 3 to 16 weeks of age and producing long-term effects on the behavior of the dogs in adulthood. So again, that's that socialization period that we really talk a lot about in the behavior world, the importance of socialization in young puppies, and that came from this study. And then on the right, we have the Belyaev foxes. So Dmitry Belyaev was a Soviet geneticist who began a selective breeding project in 1959, attempting to better understand the process of domestication and its impacts on behavior and physical traits. So the silver foxes were selected for breeding based on showing the least fearful behavior towards humans. And over time, the foxes also began to show not only tame behavior, but also floppy ears, spotted coats, and curled tails, which supported Belyaev's hypothesis that there was a genetic basis for tameness in the foxes and that it was perhaps linked to other traits. So that brings us to kind of the renaissance of canine cognition research, which started in the late 90s and early 2000s. And one of the early focuses of this research was on canine social cognition, and specifically dogs' ability to follow human gestures to find hidden food. So I included this picture from a textbook about canine cognition that shows kind of the basic apparatus for these cognitive experiments looking at dogs' ability to follow gestures. So while controlling for things like the odor of the food, the researchers are able to determine whether dogs can follow the point or the gaze of a human to help them find a hidden piece of food. And so one of the early researchers on this topic is Brian Hare, who's now at the Duke Canine Cognition Center. And he found that dogs outperformed wolves and great apes, surprisingly, in object choice tasks where a human cues the location of hidden food via pointing or gazing. This led to the development of the domestication hypothesis, which is that dogs evolved special social cognitive skills as a result of their domestication, emphasizing a unique genetic adaptation in dogs to live with humans. In contrast, Clive Wynne and his colleagues found that wolves actually could be taught to follow human gestures and gaze. And so he challenged the domestication hypothesis, emphasizing that dogs don't possess unique social cognitive skills, that they're actually typical to many other species, but that because they live with and depend on humans, they learn over time to follow human communicative cues. So he emphasizes more the influence of the environment on this cognitive ability. And then to synthesize these contrasting views and provide an explanation for differing results with different groups of wolves, McCloskey and this team of researchers in Hungary proposed that genetic predisposition to follow human social communicative cues and learning and the environment work synergistically together to promote dog-human communication. And I think that really makes a lot of sense from the way that we see behavior kind of holistically in general in dogs. But the story is far from over. So there is still research looking at this social cognitive ability in dogs and wolves. And in recent years, 2021 and beyond, researchers have replicated this cognitive testing in wolf and dog pups, and attempts to identify structural evidence of the changes associated with domestication are on the horizon as well. So the two studies on the left support the greater influence of genetics and innate ability on the dog's ability to communicate with humans as compared with wolf pups. And then Dr. Hecht is looking at comparative neuroanatomy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but kind of correlating that with cognitive testing finding. So now I want to jump into really, the literature in canine cognition is so vast that I just picked a few recent studies that I thought that dog lovers might find interesting. And these are in specific areas of cognition. So the first is this notion of language or linguistic learning. I chose a picture here of a dog with talking buttons. That's not the study I'm talking about, but I think that's a point that's really interesting to a lot of us. So this first study involved gifted word learner dogs. And these are the dogs that you may have seen in popular news articles that have just like the giant piles of toys that they all know by individual names. And these dogs are not necessarily considered typical. They're pretty exceptional dogs, but they were an interesting subject of study for these researchers. So in this study, GWL, gifted word learner dogs, were able to generalize verbal labels to novel objects based on a shared function. So the function could be pull, like a tug toy, or throw, even though the objects were not perceptually similar, meaning they didn't look or feel the same. So to test this, the dogs were trained to associate a verbal label, like pull or throw, with the toys that were either used for tug of war or for fetch. And then they were exposed to novel toys with the same functions. And then finally, in the last stage, they were asked to choose the novel object based on the functional label, and they were able to do so. So the reason that this study is so interesting, I know it's a little bit tricky to wrap your head around, but it's because we don't generally think of human language learning as something that dogs possess. We know that they can learn labels for objects, but this is really functional classification. That is a linguistic cognitive process that shares a lot of similarities to human language learning. So I thought that was super interesting. This one also kind of looking at language learning. I did pick it in large part because the head tilting is just such a cute behavior. So this is a study looking at the function of the dog head tilt that we all love. So again, the researchers used these GWL dogs, these dogs that have massive vocabularies for object identification, and found that GWL dogs tilted their heads significantly more frequently than typical dogs when hearing a toy's name. And the direction of the head tilt was individually consistent, and the owner's position did not influence the side of the head tilt. So it wasn't just that they were kind of leaning their ear toward the direction of the sound. So the researchers' conclusion was that familiarity with the spoken name, i.e., like I've heard this word before, was not enough to elicit head tilts, but rather the word must be meaningful to the dog, like these GWL dogs. I thought that was a really interesting finding because in my anecdotal experience, I found that a lot of dogs will do the head tilt with being offered something that they really enjoy, like walkies. Um, and so it seems like consistent with this study's finding that meaningful stimuli tend to elicit that head tilt. Okay, and then problem solving is another area of cognition. And this, I chose this study kind of looking at learning in the context of obedience cues and different interventions that could perhaps affect learning. So, this study investigated the playful learning hypothesis, which suggests that play after a training session can improve a pet dog's success in learning obedience behaviors. And there were two different phases to the study. So, in the first, novice dogs who played for 10 minutes after training actually did hold their stay behavior. So, they were not super versed in stay, but they were able to maintain a position for significantly longer on day 2 than novice dogs who rested instead of playing. But those results were not repeated in phase 2 when controls for the amount of exercise and time spent with the trainer were present. So the hypothesis was not fully supported by the study, and the researchers suggest that differences in exercise or relationship with the trainer could have been a factor in previous results. And then finally, I just want to touch on a few exciting additional developments in the field of neuroscience and cognition in dogs. So, a really helpful technology and tool that we have for starting to understand more deeply how dogs' brains work is awake, unrestrained functional MRI. So, traditionally, like if a patient of mine, or if one of your pet dogs undergoes an MRI for neurologic diagnosis, usually they're going to be anesthetized for that, and the MRI just gets still images. So we're looking for structural changes in the brain or the spinal cord potentially in dogs. Um, but in functional MRI, we're actually looking in real time at responses to different stimuli. And so, as you can imagine, a dog that is anesthetized for MRI is not going to give us super useful information for that. And so, this development of protocols for training dogs to voluntarily enter into an MRI machine, tolerate the horrible loud noise. I don't know if you guys have anybody's had an MRI, but they're very loud and disruptive, and it's a confined space, and you have to hold very still. but these dogs have been trained to go into the MRI, hold still, and then we can assess responses to stimuli in that context. So this is Dr. Burns, who's at Emory University, and has some really interesting research looking at functional MRI in dogs. And then this is an image from a paper by Dr. Erin Hecht, who's at Harvard. And she looked at how selective breeding in the dog has altered neuroanatomy. So looking at 62 male and female dogs of 33 different breeds, she found significant variation in the volume of different sections of the brain correlated with particular functions. So different breeds of dogs might have more or less brain volume dedicated to a particular neurologic function. And this was really trying to find structural evidence for the variation that we see in cognitive abilities and behavior in different breeds of dogs. So I wanted to take a few slides at the end just to point to some ways that dog owners, pet parents can investigate more cognition with your own pet dogs, potentially participate in research. So this Dognition site is Brian Hare's website, and he's got a battery of different tests that you can go through with your dog. There's some that is free, and then some is paid. So depending on how much you want to dive into that, there's some interesting activities you can do with your dog. And then the Dog Aging Project is a attempt to get a massive data set about different pet dogs and how various factors in their life can impact their health and behavior. And it looks like, I believe they're still enrolling participants, but also some of these canine cognition researchers that we have chatted about in this presentation are using already some data from the Dog Aging Project to get really useful information that can promote the health and longevity of dogs and potentially find translational results that are applicable to human aging as well. And then there are canine cognition labs all over the country. So, and many of them are looking for pet dogs to participate in research. So I just listed a few of them here, but if you are super interested and you want to check out your dog's cognitive abilities and participate in science, there are lots of opportunities to do so. So definitely check out who's close to you. And then finally, I know I've put quite a bit of like the primary literature in slides here, and that may be interesting to some viewers and maybe not to others. So there's also some really good kind of popular science books on the topic of canine cognition from leaders in the field. So these are three examples from Dr. Burns, Dr. Horowitz, and Dr. Hare, and super interesting and fun reads just for dog people in general. And with that, I just want to say thank you to EveryDog for having me, to you all for attending in the middle of the day. And I have, let's see if I can find the reference that I got a question about. And while I'm looking for that, I can listen for other questions if anyone has one.
Great. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful presentation and so interesting. I feel like I learned more about my dog today than I ever knew. If you guys would like to either hop off mute or put your questions in the chat box, feel free to come and ask the questions you might have.
So this is our retinal ganglion cells and nose length in the dog study. And I think there was one more that somebody might have asked about, but that I believe that was the one that we were looking for. Oops.
Awesome.
I'm just trying to get the chat popped up. Here we go.
Awesome. So much praise. What a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And if you guys ever think of anything, feel free to email us at info@, and we can always get those questions to Heather if there's anything afterwards. Oh, we got one in the chat. Has there been any formal research done with dog language learning buttons?
There has, yes, and I can email that potentially to you guys at Every Dog, and we can get
Yeah,
that out to folks. Um, yeah.
absolutely. Perfect. Yeah, we can get those resources sent out with the copy of this link after the presentation. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us, and thank you again to all who donated. Heather, what a wonderful presentation. Just a friendly reminder, we will send a copy of this at the end to everyone, and we so appreciate your time here today. I hope you guys have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.